the very roots of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is alchemy, the whole state of things, pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins, as always sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we begin today's discussion, we do want to briefly mention we have a Patreon account at patreon.com/MUHH. Consider tossing us $1 a month. We are making our Discord server available to patrons, and Taylor's been leading reading groups there. That content is available on the Patreon account, some of the audio recordings, and I think we're already on our second book, so there's plenty of extra content available for those who are interested. But today, Taylor and I are going to be continuing our expedition through Deleuze and Guattari's 1,000 Plateaus. Today, we'll be looking and focusing our discussion on 587 BC to AD 70, on several regimes of signs.
So, the fifth plateau.
The fifth plateau.
In 1,000 Plateaus. If you consider introduction to rhizomal plateau, which I do, it's numbered as 1, right? So
we've given some discussion to these timelines. I forget what the significance of this.
So this is the destruction of the temple.
Destruction of the temple.
In Jerusalem, I believe, right?
I know the 70 AD, I think.
Nebuchadnezzar and Titus. So King Nebuchadnezzar in 587 BC and Emperor Titus in AD 70. I wish I had time to have looked at some of the history of this. But you know that some of the wild evangelists, want to bring on the end of the world and the second coming of Christ with it's tied around the temple. And it's like rebuilding and all that, right?
I have a lot of Dune stuff that I don't necessarily want to bog us down in all of that too much. Only in spots where it's really pertinent. So I don't know if there's a spot.
Maybe as we develop some of the 4 regimes that they lay out.
Yeah, so I might let you quarterback as usual, and maybe I can just kind of, at least on the more technical things, and then I can kind of chip in here and there as appropriate.
We could start with a few things. So regimes of signs, and the reason why I think it's dated around the destruction of the temple is because they're going to situate some of this history of the Jewish peoples with what they call the post-signifying regime, the passional regime of subjectification. We'll get to that in a second. So I will say they lay out what they call a kind of arbitrary list of 4 regimes of signs, and they say, it's not limited to these 4, but specifically there's an organizational component. We've already seen that they work by way of tetrads and tetralogy, right? We saw in the last plateau that there is a sort of 4 dimensions of an assemblage we could consider. At least it's not the only 4 dimensions, but we can consider almost in a Cartesian coordinates where we would have laid out, right? If we cut across the middle of a square with an XY axis, we would have 4 quadrants, right? So, if you remember, in the previous one, we would have sort of bodies and the mixtures of bodies on one hand, and then incorporeal transformations, the effects of expressions and propositions attributed to bodies on the other, maybe on the XY axis, and then on the X axis horizontally. And then on the Y axis, we would have the territorialization or re-territorialization vector and the deterritorializing vector, right? Which we can somewhat consider on the one, right, like assemblages, or like the what do they say? Yeah, assemblages are sort of facing, one side is facing the strata, and on the other side is what they call the plane consistency, or the body of that. The way I try to think about it, and this is the other language they use for bodies and incorporeal transformations, the 2 sides of the assemblage on the x-axis would be what they call the machinic assemblage of bodies, and On the other side is the collective assemblage of enunciation. That's how you can remember bodies and incorporeal transformations. And then obviously reterritorialization, deterritorialization for the vertical. That's one tetrad, right? So we have another four that they lay out, and we will see that this also goes to at the end of the plateau, we'll see another tetrad of the generative, which is the pragmatics of assemblages, which they also call schizoanalysis. It'll have four dimensions: the generative, the transformational, the diagrammatic, and the machinic. We can get to that later. But I will say these four, they're all organized around the main enemy of schizoanalysis, which was the signifier, right? So there is the signifying regime that they start with, which is somewhat the one we're most familiar with, specifically with the critique of psychoanalysis, functioning by way of signifiers and signified, the critique of linguistics from Saussure onward. And from around that signifying regime of signs, they will lay out two that they don't really unpack here: the pre-signifying regime and the counter-signifying regime, which they kind of hint at, and they will develop some of the elements of these later. And then the post-signifying regime of signs, which they spend a good deal of time discussing. The other thing I would want to say is the word regime in French can also, among other things, we should also think of the term of a regimen in the sense in which there's a dietary regimen. So a regime is not merely what we might think of in a political sense of like a certain political body, which has political aspects, obviously, right, as they say. But a regime is also a regimen. So it is organized, right? It is formalized, as you might say. It has certain aspects and protocols that are in place. And so I think regime is that's the word in French. It's fine. But I think in layman's English, we might overinterpret regime, or we might not necessarily know exactly how to situate it, because we think of political regimes, right? Like nation states and stuff like that. Or a new regime has taken power, blah, blah, blah. We should also think about regimen. And I think here it might even be better to think about regimens of signs over regimes, because that word in English is a little bit less flexible. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I like that a lot. Yeah, that makes that's a good point. Nice little distinction to make. I don't know if this would be a good way to, because I'd kind of, at least by vibes, maybe thought back to Proustian signs and the type of signs that Deleuze articulates. They're obviously like, I think
another tetrad.
It's like a maybe like a a precursor. Definitely the pun on dark precursor there, just as a joke. But it kind of made sense to me when because I feel like because it was like the worldly signs, the signs of love, and I might be flubbing these because it's been so long since we looked.
No, you're correct. The worldly signs.
Those were the
sensible signs.
Those were the two that kind of stood out in my mind, because I was thinking about in the text here how they bring up love, but they also bring up, I don't know would it be appropriate to say the worldly signs could perhaps be like, well, I don't know if pre-signifying makes sense. You might be able to clarify on that end, but I think like just the fact that signification is going on, whether or not there's like an interpretation taking place, is perhaps the key like little nugget to draw there. But you can correct me if I'm wrong.
No, they do say. Remember, they give the example like you go outside, the mailman delivers a letter from the IRS, crosses his fingers. You saw walking to work, you saw two sticks aligned that look like the face of a watch. You stepped in a pile of shit. When you get to work, people are whispering about you behind your back. Doesn't matter what it means, it still signifies, right? Doesn't even take us interpreting it, which is why signifiance and interpretance, or interpretosis, which is, we can talk about, which is obviously modeled after psychosis, right? A kind of psychotic, endless interpretation of signs. But on the other side, there is a redundancy of the sign, as they say. The sign is redundant with the sign ad infinitum. And so signifiance, or as I kind of glossed it for you, if you wanted to like break down what that word would mean in the play of the suffix ience, which would be like signifieriness or signifyingness, something like that, right? That there is, no matter, doesn't even take a subject to do it. The signs are signifying, gliding. There's that. That's why they mentioned the amorphous continuum. Signifieds and signifiers are in their chain effects, are gliding along one another, redounding upon one another. So that would be that starts to lay out a little bit of the elements of the signifying regime, right? That you have those two elements, those two protocols in the regimen of that regimen of signs. Signifiance, which I did tell you is not a mistranslation or a typo for significance, right? It's signifiance is a process of signifiers redounding in their chain effects, and then interpretance, which they don't really use that word, although that's Bonveniste categories. That's the one seal we'll use to talk about this regime, although that's not what he calls it, but they call it interpretosis because it is our kind of modern affliction, if you will, right? And it does make sense why they talk about the signifying regime of signs as being a paranoid, despotic regime, right? As we saw from Anti-Oedipus, if you recall, the despotic regime is eminently paranoid, right? If the primitive territorial machine is perverse in its in the way that men organize and arrange marriages in order to assure alliances among the tribe. So perverse primitive territoriality, paranoid, despotic, and neurotic modern or capitalist civilization. It makes sense that there's a paranoia to the signifying regimen of signs. There's specifically at least on the side of interpretosis, right? Like anything can signify anything at any moment, and continually does. Even behind our backs, doesn't take our consciousness to interact with it, right?
Yeah.
And so the interpretation fuels the movement of the signifier along the signified, and vice versa, right? Signs fuel interpretation, interpretations fuels signs redounding and re-imparting signifier. So that's the first basic regime, and they start with that, I think, because of a logical expedient, right? It's easy to kind of get our heads around starting with that.
I'd like to intervene just for a moment here.
Please do.
So I just wanted to admit, I kind of, this is a bit tongue in cheek, but I feel like my Dune obsession with this stuff is this a form of, have I got the disease of interpretosis to some degree, right? Like,
oh, well,
I wonder if it's like, because it's really, I think, I mean, I don't know, it kind of crystallizes the concepts in a way, like to have this referent, but is that in itself playing into the game that you're, what I mean, into that kind of infinite regress, or like not regress, maybe an infinite egress, if you will, to other circular signs, etc.
This is. I'm going to link this. I'm going to deflect to take a detour to answer your question. So you brought up Proust and signs earlier, just a moment ago, and in Proust and signs, there's a kind of spiral of circles, similar to the circles that they describe in the signifying regime, right? There are these circles of signifiance that you can jump from one circle to another, and there's a center organized around the despot, the face of the god. And so in Proust and signs, you have those four levels that in the first version of Proust and signs, written in 1964, Deleuze is taking us, or showing how Proust is able to layer these spirals of these four circles towards what Deleuze calls in the first version, essence. He'll start to move away from that language, and I'm foregrounding this to make my point. So as you said, we move from the signs of worldly signs. The worldly signs are those in which time is wasted, right? So Deleuze gives the example of all of the signs mobilized in the setting of the salons. This is the setting of snobbery, of gossip, and then the signs of love, which they end the Plateau showing how the proposition "I love you" is different in each of the four regimens of signs that they lay out. It's different in the pre-signifying and the signifying and the counter-signifying and post-signifying. So the signs of love, which for the most part Proust characterizes as betrayal, which, as you know, in their descriptions would mostly fit in the passional post-signifying, as opposed to deception, although deception is involved, which is why it's a mixed semiotic. But he emphasizes betrayal, but deception is potentially involved, but including paranoia, because we can never intimately occupy the world that is emitted from the beloved. But those are the signs of time lost, which is in the title of the novel. Sensible signs get us, again, that we're rising towards essence, right? Sensible signs are those in which we might call the signs of apprenticeship. Sensible signs are ones that start to, they are more or less, if you will, the physical conditions of possibility for the final layer at the top of signs of art. But, for Deleuze to learn to become an apprentice is to become sensitive to signs. Simondon lays this out too when he talks about woodworking, right? When we're carving the wood with a whittling knife, we are sensitive to the feedback of the wood. We're sensitive to the singularities, the implicit forms that are inherent in the wood, working around knots, working along or against the grain, etc. And certain machines working on wood allow us to be more sensitive to certain singularities than other. Certain machines cut in a very homogeneous way and disrespect or neglect the implicit forms, while other machines are able to allow us to be sensitive to the contours of the hexaedy, as we might say, this piece of wood here, this very thing. Now, the fourth level of science is the science of art, right? That leads us towards essence, and those are the signs that are those of time regained. I will say too that third level of the sensible signs, that is the level of it's the level of involuntary memory. The Madeleine, for example, right at the start of the novel, that's a sensible sign that harkens towards essence and towards the world of art without yet being at that level. Really quickly, just to summarize, when Deleuze is going to edit and add on in 1972 and 1976, he's going to add on to Proust and Signs, reorganize it a little bit. He's going to move away from the interpretation of signs because he's being influenced by Guattari and Guattari's polemic against psychoanalysis, polemic against interpretation, which we see very clearly in Anti-Oedipus, polemic against the signifier. And he's going to begin to elaborate a more machinic reading in the third edition, or even in the second edition. He'll have a chapter on anti-logos and on transversality, a Guattarian concept. And that's going to point us away from interpretation, which, as he laid out in Nietzschean philosophy in 1962, was sort of interpreting sense and values and the interpretation of the value of values. That, for Deleuze, becomes the methodology of philosophy. But he abandons this by the time of working with Guattari, and it's going to be more about experimentation, which was why we saw towards the end of the Plateaus specifically, like when he brings up Don Juan and Castaneda, it's no longer about interpreting signs. That itself is a sickness, right? Interpretosis. It's about experimenting. And so I took that detour to say that perhaps, of course, there could be a way, and some of this is always mixed in, there could be a way that reliance on Dune obviously tells us something about your proclivities, but if we stay on the level of just interpreting Dune for its own sake without extrapolating certain lessons that we could learn, and, as you said, concretize the theoretical abstractions sometimes that we might be dealing with this complex theory, if we can embody it and incarnate it in something that and then shed light on, our own modes of living and our own ways of understanding, then yes, I think then it's not merely interpretation for interpretation's sake. It can constitute a variable of experimentation.
One little, actually, I'll interject here with just a little Dune thing was, I guess maybe the worldlier sign, something like literal worm sign in Dune, which is like basically kind of like the Fremen physically interpret the motions, because obviously the desert, right? It's like it's undifferentiated. It's like a smooth space. So the turbulence of the great sandworm of Arrakis traveling actually communicates something, or it emits a sign. It emits sign particles that can be interpreted or read, so to speak, that, right, would sort of whether or not anyone's out there to interpret that as far as humans are concerned, they still persist. But I don't know. I thought that was that's where my mind goes first when I think of like this kind of the signs of the earth or something like that. I think that's just kind of a neat, kind of cool little example of how that would work. Perhaps.
Well, again, and again, like the signs in the desert, we have to very quickly, and Paul already knows this from his training and perhaps from some of the encyclopedias that, like in the Villeneuve, they dramatize him. They show him interacting with these visual and almost like these Wikipedia entries, right? That he's learning about Arrakis, and he's probably already learned some beforehand. This is why when he and Jessica crash land, he already knows the extent to which his own leaving of signs make literally the way you're walking is the sandworms have learned to interpret, or they've learned how to be sensitive to certain signs, and to counteract that, one has to learn how not to leave those signs, right? So again,
or to mobilize them in the way that with the thumpers, right? Which is cool
with the thump. So that's a technological way of learning how to harness the sensitivity to signs for other types of harness the desert power, right? Like riding the worm and stuff like this. So yeah, I would say that these concretizations, these examples are important for two reasons. Not only to sort of make palpable what's going on in the theory and give us a little bit of an anchor point in order to experiment with our understanding and with the theory, but the other thing too is the reason why Deleuze writes Proust and Signs, because he goes from writing a book on Hume to writing a book on Nietzsche and writing a book on Kant. He's going to write this book, and then he writes this book on Proust. And he gives a somewhat Kantian reading of Proust. That's besides the point right now. But the main thing is, it's Deleuze's contention that literature, specifically Proust, is able to exemplify this best for Deleuze. But literature challenges philosophy and tries to teach philosophy a lesson about the image of thought. And so Deleuze contends that Proust is able to teach us about how philosophy's own spontaneous image that it gives itself when it comes to providing itself an image of what it means to think. Proust challenges philosophy that in ways that obviously relate to the sign, as we just discussed, because for Deleuze and for Nietzsche too, and other philosophers who bring this out as well, which is sometimes why Nietzsche is considered a writer more than a philosopher and all this shit, right? Which is really just to say that writing, literature, beyond the function of what philosophy does, is able to teach us something about the externality of the sign, and that signs are imposed as a violence upon thinking that poses a problem and forces us to think. Thinking doesn't occur through common sense and good sense voluntarily, as philosophy might sometimes think in its dogmatic, moral, or orthodox image that it gives of itself. Literature teaches us that actually signs bombard us and assail us in ways that we are not prepared for. And that's when thinking happens. So literature teaches a philosophy a lesson in what it means to think and what it means to create, because thinking thereby becomes creative when it's no longer just this internal ratiocination in a vacuum, but is something that is that when there's a genesis of thinking going on. Anyway. So yeah, that's why I think Proust and Signs and obviously this plateau, that those are the starting points I would look for. And I would also focus on the 72 and 76 which is basically contained in what's called part 2 of Proust and Signs, to see more of that interaction. The 64 version is important, that part 1, but the later editions after his meeting with Guattari, I think, would be a good place to go to see some of the connections with the 2 volumes of Capitalism and Schizophrenia.
Yeah, the talk of literature is, I think, Dune, I think maybe more so does, it more fits, I think the ambition of it, at least, is to be more of a work of philosophy in a sense than to be a typical sci-fi novel, in the sense of there's, you know what I mean? A lot of the some of the action is is de-emphasized. It's all about it's more about these macro or molar kind of aggregates and molar functions of that's the certainly we get the perspective of these individuals, but everything, the focus is on a macro, there's certainly shades of pre-individual things, the recognition of the unconscious, whether that be the Freudian or the Jungian unconscious. These are definitely things that are intentionally in the text itself by Herbert. He strategically did that, and the emphasis is on those things rather than you would typically in a kind of genre way. You know what I mean? There's the scope of this is far different than the typical pulpy sci-fi novel. So maybe that's my own cope, but I feel that there's certainly some truth to that at the very least.
Yeah, I think that and as you've told me, after volume 1, Herbert does more explicitly interweave some of the philosophical meditations, maybe that more so than they might have been more latent in the first volume.
Yeah,
that might
though there's still plenty, obviously, to pick and choose from. Even the worm sign and all that's in the first book. And anyways, again, I don't want to bog us down too much on that stuff.
And the quicksand of Arrakis.
Yeah.
I will add another element that's so I talked a little bit about the form of expression of the regimen of the signifying regimen of signs, the form of expression, right, of the interplay of signifier and signified, the different circles, the ad infinitum redundancy, which we can see in I think I mentioned maybe in the last plateau, I mentioned a little bit about information theory, right? The fact that an E has the least amount of informational value if we're just thinking about a string of characters than an X or a Z. Or I think the highest for me would be a Q not followed by a U. That's going to have the highest because of this question of redundancy and rarity. He's going to be the most redundant letter and the most common. It's going to give us less value, relatively speaking, right? If we're not, considering the chain, but just an iteration of keystrokes forming, graphemes and morphemes, than an X or a Z or a K, J. Those are all high value, and you can see this in Scrabble and the point value, right? So in any case, so that's roughly speaking some of the elements of the form of expression of that signifying regimen. The substance of expression of the signifying regimen is what they call the face. And we will see in Plateau 7. We've looked at this a little bit. Gosh, it's been so long, right? Years ago, about 5 years ago, where we looked at the chapter 4 of Machinic Unconscious, which is about faciality. And Plateau 7 is also on faciality, the face of Christ. We're going to see the way in which they define the face as a white wall black hole system. And in an interesting way, this is important now to lay out, because the wall is going to be what the signifiers bounce on in order to redound in the chain, right, ad infinitum, whereas the black hole is going to be associated more for them in the passional post-signifying regimen, right? There's a black hole of the passional that is about resonance of redundancy more so than in the signifying regimen, where we are talking about frequency. And again, frequency is important, which is why I mentioned information theory, because the frequency of the letters is what's important for the redundancy and the rarity value and the information value, right? How frequent or infrequent. The face of the God, for example, right at the center of the circles, of these radiating circles, the face of the God is sort of the attractor. Anyway, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to mention, we also did a really great discussion with Isabel Millar on this on some of her work on faciality, if you recall, that I think I'll definitely link that for anyone who's interested, because I think that was a really fun, and that's a real focus on faciality and so forth.
Was that in our second, or was that
Yes, that was the
the
second
bombshell?
or third. Yes, yes.
The
Theory
the
of a
bombshell.
bombshell or something along
Mhm.
those
Yeah.
lines was the title. But yeah, I think that's a real nice, focused, interesting episode with her.
That's right. Yeah, that's a good catch. I remember more clearly our first episode with her on her
The
book.
AI, right?
So yeah, I'd have to revisit. I don't think I've re-listened to the second one with her, and I hope she's doing well. She smartly got off Twitter long before
Yeah,
anybody else did.
right.
Um,
But back to faciality. I mean, here's where there's some cool Dune stuff. So I don't know if you wanted to pick up, and then I can just piggyback off of you, or if you want me to kind of step into that.
well, I would say a couple of things. One is they're going to use the substance of expression of the god's face administered by the priests and the signifying regimen, which they will associate with psychoanalysts throughout. And they had already talked about the piety and priestliness of the psychoanalyst and anti-Oedipus, but they're really formalizing this beyond a polemical type of strategic move in anti-Oedipus. Here they're formalizing this among these regimens, and specifically this regimen, and they will play off the face of the god administered by the priest in the signifying regimen versus in the post-signifying regimen, the double turning away of the face of the god and the face of the prophet, right? So the priest and the prophet are in opposition, at least in terms of the post-signifying regime. I do think it's not necessarily stated outright in this Plateau. It may come up, it will come up in Plateau 7. Guattari talks about a machine of unconscious. In the pre-signifying regime, Guattari will lay out pretty clearly that only certain regimes of signs necessitate faces. For them, or for Guattari in the pre-signifying regime, the face is not yet formalized as substance of expression. There's a sort of continuity of the body, because for Guattari, and we'll see this in Plateau 7, the face is in the signifying regime as substance of expression is no longer a part of the body. And we'll see their arguments why, because it does sound counterintuitive. We might think of a face as just an extension of the body, but the face is not an organ, right? It's a surface with certain with certain traits, which is what they call faciality traits, right? So here faciality is introduced, but not yet fully
Articulated.
Not fully articulated. We're given some indicators, and so I think that's why they return to it in Plateau 7. The last thing I will say that's interesting to me, they mentioned sorcerers very quickly and becoming Xanimal, for example, right? Because one of the aspects of the signifying regime will not just be the face of the god, but on the diametrical opposite within the same regime, the scapegoat, right? And the sacrificial lamb or whatnot, the goat, and that is what they mention as blocking lines of flight, keeping deterritorialization relative to the system of signifiers and the ad infinitum play. So blocking that line of flight from out of the regime. Keeping it stratified, keeping us within the stratification of expression. That's the relativity of the deterritorialization going on. But you were wanting to bring in another example of Dune. I welcome it.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, it's in the personage of the God Emperor of Dune, Leto II, who merges with Sandworm and lives this fantastical 3,500-year lifespan. What's interesting here related to faciality is that one of the only physical traits that remains essentially human is his face and so forth. Like, it's also one of the only areas of his body that's really vulnerable to attack, although this is not information that is necessarily like, oh, it's a secret, right? Another kind of interesting thing here that goes back to almost like the worldly signs or what have you is that in this process of transformation for Leto, he is in a lot of ways he's becoming animal, but like in the sense that he's losing Like he'll have these bouts of behavior that are more like the worm sort of takes over, so to speak.
Yeah.
And his major domo like is always like interpreting he can see like he'll like notice a quiver in a flipper or something like that, and that's how he knows that like he's got to get the fuck out of there so he doesn't get destroyed or what have you. So I thought that was kind of interesting. But yeah, it's neat that the tie to the face and the faciality, it's like as that, I don't know, the part of the despotic element of it, I suppose.
And we will see that the move from the despotic regime to the post-signifying passional, what they will also call authoritarian regime, and that'll be important. By the way, they only mention it in passing a couple of times in this plateau, but they do distinguish between the despotic and the authoritarian, because in the micropolitics plateau and plateau 9, we will see a theory of fascism and totalitarianism that will be important for this distinction between the despotic and the authoritarian, right? So kings or despots and dictators for them are different regimes. And I guess I would say too that, for them, there is something interesting in Leto II embodying, still retaining the face of the god, but also undergoing a kind of becoming animal, which is why they quote Lawrence. Let me find the Lawrence quote. They quote D.H. Lawrence, and I wrote it down. This is on page 122, and this is, they don't bring up Lawrence's name in the text, but they cite him. They say, okay, this is, if you look at the page, Coop, you can see this is where they give the reason for dating this plateau, 587 to AD 70, the destruction of the temple in 2 stages, the whole history of the temple, the mobility and fragility of the ark, then the construction of a house by Solomon, its reconstruction under Darius, as meaning only in relation to renewed proceedings of destruction, the 2 supreme moments of which came with Nebuchadnezzar and Titus, a temple, mobile, fragile, or destroyed. The ark is no more than a little portable packet of signs, an entirely negative line of flight occupied by the animal or scapegoat, laden with all the dangers threatening the signifier, has become an impossibility. Let misfortune befall us. This formula punctuates Jewish history. It is we who must follow the most deterritorialized line, the line of the scapegoat, but we will change its sign. We will turn it into the positive line of our subjectivity, our passion, our proceeding or grievance. We will be our own scapegoat. We will be the lamb, quote, and this is the Lawrence quote, the God who, like a lion, was given blood sacrifice must be shoved into the background, and the sacrifice God must occupy the foreground. God became the animal that was slain instead of the animal that does the slaying. I'll stop with the quotes there. It goes on, but I do think that that's an interesting thing that you do bring up, the fact that Leto II obviously foresees his own death and takes pains to ensure that it occurs. So there's obviously, and if we recall for Deleuze and Guattari, every semiotic, even though they are laying out the 4 and they say it's arbitrary, the list isn't limited, and they're going to look at these 4 because it makes sense for them, and they're trying to lay out, it would seem as though we could occupy one regimen or another, whereas they kind of want to constantly remind us it's always mixed, right? These semiotics are always mixed. There's a de facto mixture and a de jure purity, if you will, that can be mapped out, and that can be through pragmatic analysis or semiotic analysis, as they call it as well, can be located. They do the same thing with smooth space and striated space, right? De facto mixtures, but let's say degrees of purity or separation or distinction. So in any case, yeah, Leto II kind of occupies this mixed role of despot who is in his becoming animal is not only lord and liege and lion or Shai-Alud worm, but also sacrificial lamb, right? The Christ figure is eminently easy to seize upon, right? God becoming sacrificial. There was one other point I was going to make, and I'm trying to remember. It had to do with mixtures, but if it comes back to me, I'll try to recall it.
Yeah, I think there's a kind of refrain with here. I mean, Paul and Dune, Messiah, and Leto and God Emperor of Dune. Like, certainly, I think there's a lot of overlap as far as maybe in relation to like this notion of the supreme signifier. And I've got a couple of I don't know, these are epigrams or epigraphs or whatever. They're kind of like little bits of text
Epigraphs,
that
because
these are always placed in the Dune series before the chapter itself, which
epigraph.
kind of, I don't know, they don't always have a thematic tie, but there's, I don't know, there's something.
Before you read those, I remember what the last thing I was gonna say.
Go ahead.
When they say there's something unique about Oedipus in Greek tragedy,
Ooh.
if you recall that, right? And they say there's a mixture, right? Obviously, the first movement of Oedipus, maybe you could even say all of, because it's a trilogy, right? Oedipus the king, Antigone, Oedipus a colonist. So if you want to break up the mixture easily, although already the end of Oedipus Rex pulls us towards the second. So much of Oedipus Rex is occupying the regimen of the signifying regimen, right? Even from the start with the priest seer of divination of signs, obviously, Laius, the king, the despot, Oedipus, blah, blah, blah. But there's also the post-signifying sort of passional line of proceeding that Oedipus undertakes by blinding himself and going into the wilderness and becoming nomadic, so to speak, right? So that for them is an interesting indication of this mixture of the post or the signifying, the post-signifying. And
that's that's a direct fucking reference for Herbert, I
yes.
think, and especially Dune Messiah, like
Dune
in particular.
Messiah.
I mean, there's a bit of text in this plateau itself that really hammers that home that I'll bring up a little bit later. But I just wanted to read these two little bits just to highlight this kind of notion.
Do you know which books these epigraphs are from? Is this still Messiah? Is this Messiah?
Let's see. Yes, these are both from Messiah.
Okay.
I've had a belly full of the god and priest business. You think I don't see my own mythos? Consult your data once more, hate. I've insinuated my rights into the most elementary human acts. The people eat in the name of Muad'Dib. They make love in my name, are born in my name, cross the street in my name. A roof beam cannot be raised in the lowliest hovel of far Gangashri without invoking the blessing of Muad'Dib. That's from the Book of Diatribes from the Hate Chronicle.
Yeah, and that's you can imagine if the despot is at the center of the circles of signifiance in the signifying regime, everything radiates from the despot, and so everything would already be, I don't want to say contaminated, but would be suffused with the despot. And if you remember in Anti-Oedipus, the despotic regime through overcoding is interesting in the way that there is a coincidence of exogamous and endogamous marriage that the despot in the overcoding institutes, which is why, as I told you, my favorite example of this, because it's so blatant, is Gilgamesh, right? If you recall the beginning of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the drama begins because Gilgamesh is invoking prima nocta rights, first right of copulation with every with every wife, every new marriage, and the people are upset because he's overcoding all the lines of affiliation, right? At the very least, all the firstborn would be Gilgamesh's spawn. So sort of Gilgamesh is insinuating himself everywhere to a point where it becomes, you could almost say that if that complaint risen up by his peoples of Uruk, there's almost an element of the counter signifying, right? Regime, which is mobilized against states.
That's funny. I was even thinking about like I think I brought this up one of the times you've mentioned Gilgamesh in this context, but there's a scene in the Fight Club movie, and I can't remember if it's in the book or not, because the movie is just so crystallized in my head. But it's Jack and it's Tyler Durden, and they're talking, and it's like they're talking about their fathers, and he's like, "Yeah, fucker's setting up franchises." It's like he would basically his father would start a new family every so often or what have you. They're like fuckers starting up franchises. But they also have a good quote from that scene is he's like, our fathers are our models for God. If our fathers failed, what does that tell you about God? Maybe he never wanted you. Maybe he doesn't like you. Maybe he hates you. And this isn't the worst thing that can happen to you, which I've always appreciated. But anyways, that aside, I wanted. Do you think that the text that I just read, and maybe I'll read the second one, then I'll recapitulate with this question. Let me do that so it's a little bit more clear. Production, growth, and income must not get out of step in my empire. That is the substance of my command. There are to be no balance of payment difficulties between the different spheres of influence. And the reason for this is simply because I command it. I want to emphasize my authority in this area. I am the supreme energy eater of this domain and will remain so, alive or dead. My government is the economy. Order and counsel, the Emperor Paul Maudit. So with these two, I was thinking about these two quotes applying to like this kind of idea of imperial overcoding, and that feels like fairly accurate. I'm not taking too big of a leap there, am I?
No, I don't think so. I mean,
and especially I guess in the way that right in that first one, because he's saying like all these kind of acts, like build carpentry, making love, etc. All of these behaviors are now overcoded, and all the flows are kind of bottled up inside this whatever the body of the despot or.
Well, that exemplifies the fact that we've moved from a primitive regime of the full body of the earth to the despotic regime, the full body of the despot now is not the productive instance, but is the quasi cause and appropriates to itself all productivity. Right. So that's overcoding.
I want to read. You didn't read this, did you? As the part of that longer.
Not what you're looking at here.
Okay, gotcha. I'm going to go ahead and read this from A Thousand Plateaus, the plateau we looked at today.
This is more or less around the beginning of the plateau. It looks, I believe. Yeah, it is. It's from in the first few pages. Yep.
The face is what gives the signifier substance. It is what fuels interpretation, and it is what changes traits when interpretation reimparts signifier to its substance. Look, his expression changed. The signifier is always facialized. Faciality reigns materially over the whole constellation of signifiances and interpretations. Psychologists have written extensively on the baby's relation to the mother's face, and sociologists on the role of the face in mass media and advertising. The despot God has never hidden his face. Far from it, he makes himself one or even several. The mask does not hide the face. It is the face. The priest administers the face of God. With the despot, everything is public, and everything that is public is so by virtue of the face. Lies and deception may be a fundamental part of the signifying regime, but secrecy is not. Conversely, when the face is effaced, when the faciality traits disappear, we can be sure that we have entered another regime. Other zones, infinitely muter and more imperceptible, where subterranean becomings animal occur, becomings molecular, nocturnal deterritorializations overspilling the limits of the signifying system. The despot or God brandishes the solar face that is his entire body as the body of the signifier. He looked at me queerly. He knitted his brow. What did I do to make him change expression? I have her picture in front of me. It's as if she were watching me. Surveillance by the face, as Strindberg said, overcoding by the signifier, irradiation in all directions, unlocalized omnipresence. So I think immediately back here, just to recapitulate on that notion of faciality and Leto II, I mentioned earlier how he retains his human face as really kind of the only sort of human that's a bit redundant, right? Part of him, and how his subjects are sort of interpreting that face and so forth. But what here I thought was kind of interesting is this discussion of, let's see, where he says, like the public, everything becomes public because of Leto II's like prescient abilities. But due to that prescience and surveillance of him, the despot, everything becomes public and legible to him or what have you, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting too about the
this would be like this is localized omnipresence, not unlocalized.
Right. I mean, think about the display of the faces of emperors or kings and queens, whoever's ruling at the time, on money, on coinage, and all of that. Right. There's something interesting about that dissemination, and I would say too, that section you just read is where I texted you the other day saying, remember in our discussion of the Schreber case, Freud points out that that Schreber's wife kept a picture of Flechsig, Schreber's doctor, in the house, kind of as there's something interesting about that detail that Freud adds to the mix of of his interpretation. And obviously we could read it on one level as in a very basic sense, that Schreber's wife is grateful to her doctor. I say her as an HERR. The great doctor,
hair doctor,
yeah, that saved her husband. She's grateful, but there is this. There's a new significance given to the fact that it's almost as though she wanted to incorporate the face of, and if you recall, Schreber too at times associates Flechsig with the lower god, right? And his sort of the higher god, lower god dichotomy. Freud reads it as, the higher god is, Schreber's father, and the lower god is his brother, or it's Flechsig. Freud doing the very basic edibilization axis that is his. That really comes to the fore in his writing, or at least he recognizes it specifically in the Schreber case. Nonetheless, it's as though Schreber's wife wanted to incorporate the face of the deity in order to surveil her husband and keep him from going back down
relapsing,
this line. Relapsing down this schizophrenic line of flight. So I guess that's why that and that detail has always struck me as strange, because Freud doesn't really provide much of interpretation. It's just it's like him laying out, as he does, and he likes to do in his case studies. He organizes by kind of laying out the facts of the case, and that fact insinuates itself in his layout. So
I think back to Leto, what's so interesting here is like just the kind of I don't know, the fact that part of his golden path to like for humanity to proliferate, and I think really I'll be bold enough to say like to get out of these Oedipal traps and these kind of images of thought that trap us is he wants to do it. Herbert wants to go through this like wonky eugenic shit where Leto like breeds humans that are imperceptible to beings with prescience, because beings with prescience trap us into these, I'll again bugger the concept of image of thought a little bit. They trap us in these visions of the future that becomes its own interpretation rather than like it's a deterministic thing that we have to follow. Like, or maybe it leads us into determination. So he wants us to get out of these determined paths by these prescient beings by literally breeding into his descendants a gene that makes them imperceptible, so that they can't be, so they can escape this surveillance. So it's, and he wants,
go ahead.
He wants humanity to follow this kind of line of flight out of these Oedipal traps, these prescient traps, etc., to really open up creativity and boundlessness and so forth. So
two things. One would be that obviously Herbert has to take the eugenicist strain, because he's already developed the Kwisatz-Haderach around genetics, right? So genetics is already been the vehicle chosen for that, right? The other thing that's the encoding of memories, right? As the Kwisatz-Haderach can not just go down the male descendant line or epigon or forefather line, but go down the foremother line, right? Is able to. The other thing would be too is that, as they mention, becoming's animal, becoming's imperceptible. We know once we've gone from the deceptiveness and paranoia and publicness, the openness of the signifying regime, once we've gotten out of that into becoming's animal, becoming's imperceptible, we know we've changed regimes of signs, right? And so there is something to Coop about this becoming imperceptible. I believe is has this, you use the right word for it. It is engineering a line of flight. And the other thing would be too is that escaping prescience is a way of continuing the Butlerian jihad, because now it's a question not just of technical machines being overthrown, but really at the heart of it, as Deleuze and Guattari make clear, humans are never enslaved to technical machines. They're always sort of enslaved to the social machine, of which technical machines are merely an extension. And so it's about the social machine engineering these technical machines at the heart of the Butlerian jihad and at the heart of Leto II, following the golden path, if you will, right? It's about forestalling or combating a certain social machine that would regiment humans in a certain way.
Yeah. And this is what's so disappointing in the sequels to the Frank Herbert Dune books that his son and Kevin J. Anderson did, is that it goes from like this notion of it's not like machines themselves. It's not this like, yeah, but it's about the social relationships that are enabled by these machines. So for them to take the focus and make it on like actual machines as the enemy of humanity really like misses the entire
kind of
point of the whole like series, I think,
I think it's a kind of fetishism in the Marxian sense, right? There's a mystification undergone when we take the technical machine to be the perpetrator of it mystifies the social relation at the heart of the technical machine, or what Simondon thinks about in terms of the interplay of norms and values instituted between social progress and technical progress, and why there needs to be a kind of, yes, it can be metastable, but there needs to be a kind of equilibrium that is at least provisionally instituted. And yes, it can be punctuated by moments of disequilibrium, but kind of like in the quote you read, Paul's like, I don't want production growth to exceed or be out of step with income growth. There has to be, these punctuated levels of equilibrium, lest there not only things fall outside of overcoding, which is the point, but also for it's what he commands, right? It would institute levels of it would bring about, obviously, the seeds of revolution, overthrow of the despotic body, which would institute, as they kind of hint at here, it's the bourgeoisie that seem to perfect the signifying regime. They make everything radiate out and redound back upon a center, whereas it's the proletarians that seem to institute these lines of proceedings that indicate we're in the post-signifying regime, the passional lines, which I guess we could talk a little bit about, right? The post-signifying regime, right? The date of the plateau is named after a particularly salient post-signifying regime, 586. Is it 586 to 70, or is it 587? 587 to 70. 587 BC to 70, right? The fundamental or extensive event in the history of the Jewish people, the destruction of the temple in 2 stages. So that's where this plateau gets its date. And again, like anything else, it's a mixed semiotic, right? There's still residues or elements of a signifying regime, because you will see throughout the Old Testament, there is this struggle of whether or not to reinstitute a king, and which does eventually happen, right? But for a while there, at least, that tendency is forestalled. And then and then they briefly mentioned that there is also the counter signifying elements of the counter signifying regime, right? From they link it back to a couple of biblical scholars, the Habiru and the Kenites, right? The sort of this warrior past, which is why they mention is it Moses's father-in-law, Jethro the Kenite, right? Who gives them sort of the secret of the numbering number. Yeah. And the Kenites are the metallurgical caste, and the Habiru are sort of this warrior caste, this nomadic warrior caste. And so there will be mixed in with the Jewish people.
That's interesting, because like the priesthood, like in Messiah, Paul's Fremen, some of them, I lost you there, you for a minute. Yeah. So I don't know if you were stopped on purpose, or you were.
No, I was only going to say we know this from Moses and monotheism that we looked at, right? The nomadic past of the Hebrews, a continuing relationship with the nomadic numerical organization that inspired them, and their own particular becoming nomad. Their line of deterritorialization owed much to the military line of nomadic destruction. So even when they switch to a great concrete example of the post-signifying regime, they do at least here, and they hint at some of the signifying regime, but they're pointing out the counter-signifying regime that's also a part of this. So again, a de facto mixture, but they're going to try to use this as an example for bringing out the purity of the post signifying regimen. But you were going to say something, so I apologize.
Oh, I was going to talk a bit about how in Messiah, the former like Fedaykin, so like the Paul's death commando, kind of like Praetorian Guard effectively is roughly how you would think of them. One of them, Korba, becomes the high priest of the Kizarate is what they refer to it. But he doesn't really, Herbert doesn't really like spell out the religion in full, right? Like he just kind of like builds that little entity, but he doesn't like give us the shape, too much of it, right? So it's interesting how this priest or like this warrior caste become like the nomadic element becomes the sort of part of this despotic religious overcoding or system or what have you.
And the Fremen are a great, I mean, they would exemplify the counter signifying regime. This is why I brought this up probably over a year ago when I said one of the first things I recall from, maybe it was just when we read the book together and had the Dune episode on the first book, where one of the things that consternates the Harkonnens, I believe it's from the Harkonnens, it could also be from the Empire, is the question of counting the numbers of, they don't, because as Deleuze and Guattari said, yes, the signifying and pre-signifying regime have to, there are numbers there, but it's not a numbering number. And we will get to this in probably Plateau 12 on nomadology. But at the very least, that's one of the things that Duncan Idaho is trying to do, is go around to the Sieches and try to get a sense of what potentially could become allies for the Atreides. It's also to count, to number them in a way that they hadn't yet been able to be numbered. So we will get more about the counter signifying regime. But in this plateau, obviously they start with the signifying that helps to give clarity for the others. They're going to then focus on the post signifying, the passional, the authoritarian regimen of signs. And they kind of suggest that, or they do stipulate that one of the ways in which the post signifying transforms, if you will, takes root, is a packet of signs from the signifying regime starts to work on its own account and develop a line of flight, what they call a proceeding. And proceeding does mean grievance as well, in the sense in which the French procès, PROCES, means trial or lawsuit. That's what Masumi translates as proceeding. So this is why they talk about Kafka and his different assemblages, his different types of proceeding, right? The hotel proceeding, the ship proceeding, the father proceeding, the court proceeding. Literally in French, the Kafka's famous story, the trial, is the same word here as proceeding. But a little packet of signs starts to work on its own account in this line of flight, based on a grievance or proceeding. And here now the line of flight is no longer blocked relatively and negativized through the scapegoat. But this goes back to that line I read, we become our own scapegoat, right? The line of flight becomes positive. It won't become absolute. This is precisely why it's still located within a regimen, right? To reach the absolute deterritorialization. This is why at the end of the plateau, they bring up, you can see how it's ordered, right? I mean, the plateau is interesting because, again, a mixture. Each plateau is going to be mixed in this way, not just intercommunicating rhizomatically with the other plateaus, but it's going to be laying out the particular, let's say, topic or theme of discussion and the conceptual impetus behind each plateau, including the dates and names involved, right? And then we will see there's always going to be a moment. It could sometimes happen at the end of the plateau. It could be interspersed throughout the middle. But each plateau, too, is going to reflect upon the overarching theoretical ensemble that's at play, right? So at the end of the plateau, with the diagrams that we saw, right, like laying out pragmatics or schizoanalysis, the four elements, the generative, transformational, diagrammatic, and machinic, laying out more of the theory of the abstract machine. We saw specifically in in Plateau 3, on the geology of morals, we saw them lay out that there is an abstract animal, right? There's an abstract machine of animality that they credit Saint-Hilaire for trying to elaborate in the face of great opposition from Cuvier and Viau and others. So there we already saw that the abstract machine, as they say at the end of the plateau, is not only sort of at one, the abstract machine is kind of bifacial as well. And I'm not trying to bring up the face of the despot, but it's on one side, it's obviously a part and parcel of the plane of consistency, because the abstract machine for them is defined by unformed matters and functions, right? Physically unformed matters, semiotically unformed functions. And so at that level, we cannot distinguish form of expression or expression, the plane of expression and the plane of content, right? Plane of content and expression both have a form and a substance, each to their own. That's another tetrad, right? There's a doubling of this duality of plane and expression, or expression and content. But on the level of the plane of consistency, that side of the abstract machine, we cannot yet distinguish expression and content. Now, but on the other side, in the strata, there is an encasing or an encasing, an embedding of the abstract machine in the strata, and necessarily so. They give reasons for this, right? On the one hand, the abstract machine is inseparable from a plane of consistency. This is what gives it its potentials. On the other hand, the strata would never basically be able to formalize content and expression without the abstract machine that propels them and endows them with the matters and functions that will take form. It's kind of similar to, in that sense, Simondon's pre-individual field of singularities, where I'm trying not to mix terms here. Deleuze sometimes talks this way. Let me go back. Let's imagine Simondon is discussing a pre-individual field that is full of potentials. It's dynamic, it's metastable. So his famous example is obviously crystallization, but we can also think about supersaturated solutions and the introduction of a certain singularity, a certain germ, can cause the field to crystallize and individuate, right? Not all germs are appropriate for all pre-individual fields, or in terms of crystallization. Not all mother liquors will crystallize just with any singularity. There has to be not adaptation, but there has to be if you will, a coalescence, right? I mean, it takes a grain of sand won't necessarily crystallize, but certain other germs or seeds, if you want to call it that, will. So I think here too, there's a sense in which the abstract machine or the plane of consistency can be thought of as a pre-individual field, and both the field and the singularity are necessary for crystallization, right? They don't happen apart from one another, and I do think that that's why for Deleuze and Guattari, the strata in and of itself is not the enemy. Obviously, the strata allow, for example, they say, for humans at least, I don't know if this is how they exactly describe it, but for humans, and I could be speaking out of turn, but the three great strata are the organism, signification, and subjectification, right? Those are the strata. And for them, they do want to make it clear that even if the whole point of experimentation, the whole point of forming, how do you make your own body without organs, which we'll see in the next plateau, their whole point about desubjectifying, designifying, or loosening the stranglehold of signification, and also de-stratifying the organism. This has to obviously done with some nuance and some and at least for them it's like you have to keep a minimum of strata. You have to keep a minimum of signification in order to function in the world of grammatically instituted laws, right? Lest you be institutionalized. You have to keep a minimum of subjectification to to function in this world of order words. You have to keep a minimum of the organism, right, at the very least, so that you can continue to live vitally. So I think for them, which is why they will say in the next plateau, body without organs can be a bit misleading, because the organs are not the enemy. What's the enemy is the stratification of the organs, the organization of the organs, which is what forces us to be an organism. And in fact, in Anti-Oedipus, they make clear that this is the same case with desiring machines. Desiring machines organize us into an organ or into an organism, which doesn't mean they're the enemy, obviously, right? That's just a natural consequence of intensities forming extensive systems. But that doesn't mean that intensities aren't there underneath lurking for other potential becomings. Anyway, I just wanted to make clear, I guess my main thing that
that was all good.
The main thing that I expanded upon was each plateau is not only going to cover a theme and, let's say, a certain abstract machine that's dated and named, but is going to elaborate this theory of schizoanalysis or rhizome analysis, or just the theory of assemblages writ large, right? So there's going to be levels of concreteness and discreteness and distinctness in each plateau, but there's going to be the more general theory that's going to little bits and pieces are seeded throughout the plateaus. And so it's good to be sensitive to both of those. It's good to be sensitive to the plateau that you're reading at the time, but also be out hunting out for the continuities. So we have to move from this kind of synchrony to diachrony, and this is why the book is rhizomatic, right? And not necessarily tree structured. Anyway, I'll pause there.
Along those lines, I'll mention briefly, I do have some textual basis for some of this Dune connection, because they actually make note in the nomadology chapter. It's note 70. They note Children of Dune, the book, which is the third in the series.
Mm-hmm.
And that's more, I mean, we've talked at nauseum. We talked with Henry Summers Hall about this, about nomadology, and we directly referenced some of that. So I'm not going to go that far into it. I just wanted to flag that and let the audience know that I'm going to put a link to that chapter, or to that episode rather, in the show notes, so people can, if you want to just to kind of plant those seeds for whenever we get around to that plateau.
It is interesting, Coop, that before we started the series, we have at least looked at faciality. Plateau 7, we've at least looked at apparatus of capture with Eugene Holland. We've at least looked at nomadology with Henry Summers Hall. So we've kind of already out of order, but we obviously I think we still want to tackle those plateaus for our own and to revisit them, and I think also to redevelop some of the things that we may have missed when we were just jumping into a plateau rather than reading cover to cover.
If you'll indulge me, I kind of wanted to discuss a little bit about the scapegoat and Paul Atreides and Leto II Atreides and their relationships there. I think in particular, the discussion of prophetism and this this would fall more in line with Paul and Dune Messiah and his sort of narrative arc there. This kind of his foresight, actually his prescience, becomes this trap. It becomes this also a burden that he must bear, because basically and maybe I should also say spoiler alert for Dune Messiah before I get too much into this too, because one of the main things, and I think one of the dramatic ironies here, is that Paul, in spite of being the most powerful being in the universe, he is unable to save his beloved, which is, I think, the great, and to me, that's the brilliance of Dune Messiah itself, is it really it reads like a Greek tragedy, and this great dramatic irony in the picture of Paul is all powerful, yet unable, yet ultimately powerless, to the sort of two sides to the coin, because he acts as this scapegoat. He even gouges out his eyes, or he, metaphorically, let's say, a different mechanism results in Paul becoming blind, not only literally physically by his eyes being dissolved, but his loss of his prescient visions as well. And so at the end of Dune Messiah, Paul walks into the desert blind. This is the Fremen actual tradition as well, is someone who is blind is cast out to walk the desert and be consumed by Shai-Hulud, because effectively, I would assume there's some type of the idea behind it being, this is me doing interpretosis, right? Reading the signs in a way that, the blind are a burden on the rest of the tribe, or something of that nature. I would suppose, right? Because the Fremen are like hyper pragmatic, just because the conditions of Arrakis and survival there demand that they be so, demand that their ethical and religious and social practices all be aligned with survival because of the harshness of the environments that they deal with, right? But I do want to read a couple of lines from the plateau itself that go here. Finally, the face or the body, or start over. Finally, the face or body of the despot or god has something like a counterbody, the body of the tortured, or better, of the excluded. There is no question that these two bodies communicate, for the body of the despot is sometimes subjected to trials of humiliation or even torture, or of exile and exclusion. So that's one. And then here's another, just real one sentence here. Oedipus at least understood that. He tortured himself, gouged out his own eyes, then went away. So the connection to Paul here is that due to his prescience, he already foresees his own end, right? So he still walks the path, so to speak. And he even laments, like, the issue is not that the issue is that I may grow bored because I've already lived this path so many times, which I think is one of my favorite, absolutely favorite lines. Yeah. But yeah, he literally, he gives himself up to be effectively have his eyes gouged out, walk away, die in the desert. So I just wanted to highlight that before we wrapped up the episode.
This may be a strange reference, but I can thank my wife for it. There's the Disney movie, The Emperor's New Groove, where
yeah, I think you've mentioned this before, actually.
Well, at the very least, without going into deeper analysis of the movie, which is definitely merited in this context, but there's obviously the becoming. I believe he becomes is it an alpaca, a llama? I always mix those two up. He becomes a llama. The emperor of I forget the names. Lindsay's gonna be mad at me, but no, the emperor becomes a llama and has to be saved by one of the, call them proletarians, but one of the peasants who he was going to displace from his area amongst hundreds or thousands of others, because he was going to build a kind of pleasure palace and then by the end of the movie, he, through this becoming animal, is able to obviously come out the other side. All things, he becomes a better emperor and all this stuff. In any case, those are the two diametrically opposed sides, right? This although he doesn't necessarily become a sacrifice, but at the limit, this becoming animal is particularly could be considered a line of flight. And I think that's the interesting thing in the signifying regime. That line of flight is negativized and blocked, which is why they say that often in these scapegoat rituals, you have one animal that's sacrificed and another that's sent out into the desert, right? And I think that's where the post-signifying regime becomes interesting, because the line of flight itself can take on a positive valence.
Yeah, I mean, Leto too also is scapegoat by him becoming worm, becoming animal, and assuming the mantle of the god emperor. Like, he has this interesting duality in that he also, like, there's a positive line of flight that he's opening for humanity by, like, because he understands that he will die. Like, that's all part of the plan, is for him to die. And once this golden path reaches a certain place, like, then his death is what establishes the possibility for a line of flight for humanity to follow, and so forth. So that's a
new proceeding, right? That's the interesting thing.
And then his body becomes like the new, and he also gives birth. Here's the becoming woman too for Leto too. Specifically, Paul doesn't really have this as much, although to some degree, I think the Kwisatz Haderach being, Herbert describes it as being the unification of the giving and the taking force. So almost this like Eros Thanatos sort of duality or dialectic or what have you. But in Leto, he becomes really pregnant with the future, and like literally his body becomes a new form of sandworm. So he lives on in a certain capacity.
That's good. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, I don't know if do you feel like there's anything else we can't miss out on?
I guess the last thing then, because we obviously didn't have time to discuss all 40, 50 pages of this, I would say that's 146, right? Towards almost the last page of the plateau. It is good to see them distinguish between the the four components of regimes of signs, which form the object of pragmatics with a capital P, which they equate with schizoanalysis. So the generative component, the transformational component, the diagrammatic, and the machinic. We've kind of talked about all of them in a certain way without specifically pointing them out. If the generative is meant to be the level of tracings, the level as in the sense in which they are opposed to maps, at the generative level, which would be lowest in the sense of deterritorialization. But they say the generative component shows how a form of expression located on the language stratum always appeals to several combined regimes. In other words, how every regime of signs or semiotic is concretely mixed. So I've kind of emphasized that throughout. And it also points out how language itself is not is not self-sufficient to form a regime of signs or to form its own form of expression. This is particularly their critique of Chomsky, and Chomsky's the one who comes up with the term abstract machine in his generative grammar, and they say it's too abstract, or it's not that it's not abstract enough. That's the problem, right? So the second is transformational. This is where mappings occur, and as they say, whenever we make tracings, we always have to place them back on the map, lest we fall into a kind of transcendence of language, of image of thought. So the transformational component shows how one abstract regime can be transformed into another, and especially how it can be created from other regimes. So this is why they start with the signifying regimen or regime of signs and show how the post-signifying it transforms, not generated, but I suppose they do a little both, but they show how it transforms the signifying regime, right? By a packet of signs starts to operate on its own and carries out this line of flight that takes on a positive valence and acts as a preceding. They say the second component, the transformational, is obviously more profound because all mixed regimes presuppose these transformations from one regime to another, past, present, or potential. The third component is diagrammatic. It consists in taking regimes of signs or forms of expression, extracting from them particle signs or science particles that are no longer formalized, but instead constitute unformed traits capable of combining with one another. This was that level of the abstract machine that I was saying, physically unformed matters, which are not substances, right? Which are formed matters, but physically unformed matters, semiotically unformed functions. And it's that level that they already had this, I believe in, science particles is great because it's at this level that we can indifferently say or can't distinguish between a particle or a sign, right? Both and neither at the same time, almost like a Schrodinger thing, right? So they say this is the height of abstraction, but also the moment at which abstraction becomes real. Everything operates through abstract real machines, which have names and dates. Hence the Plateaus. One can abstract forms of content, but one must simultaneously abstract forms of expression, for what is retained of each are only unformed traits. That is why an abstract machine that would operate purely on the level of language is an absurdity. Again, going back to that critique I just mentioned. It is clear that this diagrammatic component is in turn more profound than the transformational component. The transformations of a regime of signs operate by the emergence of ever new abstract machines. Finally, the last properly machinic component is meant to show how abstract machines are effectuated in concrete assemblages. It is these assemblages that give distinct form to traits of expression, but not without doing the same for traits of content, the two forms being in reciprocal presupposition or having a necessary unformed relation that once again invents the form of expression from behaving as though it were self-sufficient. So I think there, and we can pause there, and maybe this will be the sort of starting to wrap us up. This is where I would wrap around back to the beginning of our episode, Coop, where you brought out Proust and signs and the four levels. There is a sense in which we could potentially see an isomorphism between these four levels or four components of regimes of signs that pragmatics analyzes between the generative, transformational, diagrammatic, and machinic, and seemingly see a similar type of structure in the worldly signs, the amorous signs, the sensible signs, the art signs. We would have to do a little bit of shifting, but I do think that would be something for listeners who are interested in getting Deleuze and Guattari. I do think Proust and Signs is a good introduction to Deleuze, especially for those who are undertaking to read Difference and Repetition for the first time. Proust and Signs announces some of the themes different repetition, but it also points beyond it to the Capitalism and Schizophrenia volume, specifically in part 2 of Proust and Signs, which I mentioned were written in 72 and 76. I do think that's where I would kind of go. And if people were interested in, and of course you and I are, for these 4 components of regimes of signs that culminate in the machinic, mapping those spirals and Proust and Signs of the worldly, amorous, sensible, and art signs, I wonder how they would map onto these 4 components. I'm very interested because it makes sense. The generative would be the worldly signs. That we're only on the level of tracing. The signs of love, but each sign, there's interesting the way that Deleuze does it. He will build from worldly signs to the signs of art, but he will also reverse course and take us back down the path and show that, and this is why the signs of art are the signs of time regained, and will show on the way back down towards worldly signs that those worldly signs were absolutely necessary for the training involved, the apprenticeship involved in preparing us for the signs of art. And so to a certain extent too, there's a necessity for each level, the generative to the machinic and back again. The generative is a necessary training for getting to the abstract real machine. You feel like that's a nice way to wrap up?
Yeah, I'll just mention to the listeners that, I mean, for me, the translation of Proust and Signs as well, it reads exceedingly well. Like, I don't know, there's
Richard Howard.
It's
He's
a very
great translator.
Yeah, it's real. There's some really just incredible language just in the translation itself. And even if you're not necessarily, your interest isn't piqued perhaps by the discussion of signs, I mean, you can see Deleuze also mentions, he formulates there the body without organs, the example being a spider in its web, which I think is also a really
that would have been for 76.
Fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Certainly one of the later ones, but I think just another way, like another, if you're struggling with that concept, I think that's another, besides, orchid and wasp, I think that's maybe even a little bit more abstract than the spider and the web. Feels like really kind of hits the notion of the body without organs, even like it's a more shining sort of example, just because of because in orchid and wasp, you have sort of 2 living things, but I don't know. I suppose you could. I mean, maybe there's a problem with image of thought in a sense, not considering the web part of the living being of the spider, right? Like that itself, mm-hmm. Right? Yeah. You can. That's you know what I mean. You can kind of see, like, right, the kind of the tyranny of something, of signs or something like that. I don't know. I'm getting a bit out of
the radiation of the circles, right? The radiation of the circles on the web, right? Because the writer is the spider and is sensitive to the signs radiating out from the web. The other thing I would say, Coop, you're right to bring up the fact that the body without organs is exemplified in that 3rd edition, added last. But I would say too that in Proust and Signs, the wasp and the orchid, you're right. For Deleuze, Proust himself writes about the bumblebee and the orchid. And so Deleuze will take up this notion of the aparallel evolution first with Proust, but it's Remy Chauvin, as we saw in the Rhizome Plateau, who is writing at the time, I think in the early 70s, about the wasp and the orchid and this capture of code. And that's why Deleuze will shift to the wasp instead of the bumblebee as example, because he's moving from Proust's more aesthetic metaphor, if we want to use that loosely, to now a scientific example, and how it's not about resemblance. There's something going on where there is a capture where the orchid forms an image of that the wasp interacts with that would be its mate. And so there's an interesting, not just in the theme of becomings, because there's a becoming of the orchid and the wasp, but also the theme of sexuality, how sexuality is mobilized in this, which I think Deleuze always does his most profound meditations on sexuality, maybe even more so than in the Masochism book on, I think he's even more profound of a reader of sexuality, specifically because of Proust. And when he's reading Proust, it's Proust that gives Deleuze, and writing with Guattari and Anti-Oedipus, the notion that we are all we're all molarly heterosexual. We're all statistically homosexual, but we're molecularly transsexual. He gets that straight from Proust, and he already situates that. That'll be the second edition of Proust and Signs in 72, reflecting on sexuality and anti-Oedipus. He will incorporate that into the second edition of Proust and Signs. And it's with Proust that Deleuze, unlike a lot of commentators of Proust at the time who shy away from homosexuality throughout the search, Deleuze does not shy away from the dirty little secret, if you will, that's often just left out of the commentaries. Deleuze doesn't mince words and sees in it something extremely positive and not something to try to repress or suppress from the discussion.
Since you mentioned masochism, I wanted to just briefly for the listeners, well, because you've highlighted, I think there's a brief little tidbit in here about courtly love and masochism. And so what I may do is also put in a link to one or both of the episodes we did with Eugene Holland. I forget which one we discussed about the kind of masochism, like in masochism in relation to capitalism.
The perversity of the market.
Yeah, I think so.
Something like that. That would have been our second episode with him. So not our most recent, but the one before that.
I'll be sure to link that too, because that's a good discussion. I thought it was interesting too. I can't remember the specific bit of text here, but I was like, oh, okay, I can kind of see this is a jumping off point for Eugene and that whole idea.
I will say the next plateau, whether we do it next week or not, is totally up to us. It's much shorter. It's, I think, no more than 30 pages. So we can talk about that.
Unless you had anything to add for this week's episode, let's go ahead and I'll sign us off if you...
Okay.
We'll go ahead and stop there and wrap up this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper and Cherry and Taylor Atkins. We'll see you all next week.
The very rules of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is outcast, to the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is a typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.